In the early years of World War II, the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command faced major problems with precision bombardments. Nighttime bombings were notoriously inaccurate, and a significant proportion of the bombs did not hit the intended target. As part of the solution, the Air Ministry approved the establishment of a specialized unit within Bomber Command to lead and guide bombing formations with greater precision. This unit was named Pathfinder Force. The Pathfinder Force was created to tackle the problem of inaccuracy by deploying specially trained crews that marked targets with colored torches and markers. The most common designs were the 250-pound bomb containers, which were adapted to carry 60 colored pyrotechnic torches, usually red, green or yellow. These containers fell apart at a predetermined height, spreading the burning torches, which then floated to the ground and remained lit for about 3 minutes. The Pathfinder Force flew ahead of the main formation, identifying turning points and marking the start of the bombing run to precisely guide the following aircraft to the target. DT804 and its 7-man crew were part of this elite unit. Halifax DT804 was a Halifax B Mark II Series 1 Special, which was produced late in the war. It was part of the last series of DT aircraft, built between January and March 1943. She entered service on the 18th of February 1943 and flew just over 71 hours. Her crew consisted of Pilot Flying Officer Ronald Hughes, 25 years old, from Liverpool. Flight Engineer Sergeant Ernest Bell, 25 years old, from Belfast. Navigator Sergeant John Kennedy, 22 years old, from Manchester. Air Bomber Sergeant Ronald Hodge, 20 years, from Morton. Wireless Operator Sergeant John Jack Davidson, 32 years old, from Glasgow. Tail Gunner Sergeant Alexander Taylor, 22 years old, from Lossiemouth. And Mid-Upper Gunner Sergeant Alexander Tannock, 20 years old, from Paisley, who is unfortunately not in this photograph. Before an Allied land invasion could take place in Western Europe, which would eventually lead to D-Day, the Allied Air Force had to neutralize the Luftwaffe. One of the most crucial areas for German aviation production was the Ruhr area, also known as the weapons smithy of the Third Reich. Disrupting this region would have a direct impact on the heart of Germany's war industry. It was in this context, the Battle of the Ruhr, that these 7 men and DT804 would be deployed. Our crew had already completed 6 missions when they set off for Wuppertal on the 29th of May 1943, which would sadly be their last flight. 719 aircraft were deployed that night. 292 Lancasters, 185 Halifaxes, 118 Sterlings, 113 Wellingtons and 11 Mosquitoes. DT804 took off from Graveley at 22:20 hours UK time. The planned route was to gather over Orford Ness, enter mainland Europe via Domburg, continue to Ameln, then Wuppertal, and back via Gevelsberg, Remscheid, Eupen, Nock, and back to base over the North Sea. That night, the Pathfinder Force's marking was the most successful since the start of the Battle of the Ruhr. More than 280,000 fire bombs hit their targets and caused a massive firestorm. From a military point of view, the raid was considered a success. A report from Bomber Command states 611 aircraft, out of a force of 719, attacked the Barmen district of Wuppertal with very great success. The fire-raising technique was effectively employed, complementing ground marking, and resulted in the best concentration achieved by the Pathfinder Force. Immense damage was caused to the town, covering over 1,000 acres and affecting 113 industrial sites, as well as totally disrupting the transport system and public utilities, rendering 118,000 people homeless. We lost 33 bombers but destroyed at least 7 enemy fighters. However, the human cost was disastrous, 3,400 killed and 2,500 injured. The majority of these victims were caused by the firestorm. There was no place where citizens were safe. People who stood outside or went out to help were immediately caught in a sea of fire or falling debris. Anyone who could reach a shelter or hide in their cellar was only temporarily safe. The fire deprived many of them of all their oxygen, causing them to die of suffocation. According to a resident of Wapatal, there was a saying after the attack. If you stand on a trash can in Barman, you can look across the whole of Wapatal. DT804 had successfully completed its mission and turned away from the target towards its return route. When they flew into Belgium from Germany, the aircraft was picked up by radar position Lurch in Sandramal, Allier, 10 kilometers northwest of Liege. In the night of 29 to the 30th of May 1943, 2 night fighters were deployed in the Lurch sector. Lieutenant Schnorfer, better known as the Night Ghost of St. Trond, was the first to take off at 23:51 hours in his Messerschmitt Bf 110G4. He would have a successful sortie with 3 victories. He shot down Sterling Bf 565 at 00:48 hours and Sterling Bk 688 at 02:22 hours. At 01:25 hours, Oberlieutenant Riedel put him on the trail of a Halifax. This was Halifax DT804. The German crew would later report. After approaching with our FUG 202 at 01:38 hours, I came from the top right 200 meters from the plane and identified it as a Halifax. Shortly afterwards, I did the first attack from below, but it didn't have any effect. The subsequent second attack caused a severe fire in the left wing, after which the Halifax fell down steeply. I followed the burning plane until it hit the ground at 01:43 hours, 1.2 kilometers east of Beudingen, 7 kilometers northwest of St. Trond. For Lieutenant Schnorfer, it was his 11th victory in the war so far. He survived the war and became the most successful German night fighter with 121 victories. The attack had been carried out so quickly and precisely that the crew had hardly any chance of escaping. 6 of the 7 crew members died unfortunately. Only wireless operator John Jack Davidson survived the attack. What happened on board in the last few minutes is uncertain, but letters and cards written by Davidson as a prisoner of war show that he was thrown out of the plane by other crew members. He probably bore the full brunt of the first attack, after which his companions strapped on his chest parachute and threw him out through the front escape hatch. Shortly after, the second attack took place, and the aircraft went into a steep dive. The G-forces made it impossible for anyone else to escape. However, this remains speculation. There is, however, a discrepancy between what the local people say and what the official German documents say about where Davidson would have landed. Residents of the Arsenweg say Davidson landed on the edge of the Finn, a forested area. Since he was shot in his leg 9 times and broken arm, he couldn't move much and called for help. Jeff Bowen, who lived nearby at the time, woke up and went out to help him. He immediately saw that he couldn't do anything and called Dr. Lowett from Zoutlieu. Dr. Lowett also concluded that Jack's wounds were too severe and decided that the only chance of survival was to surrender to the Germans. Jack was then taken to a hospital in Brussels. Looking at the German telex message that was sent after the crash on the 31st of May, it stated, 6 men dead, 1 man parachuted near Nieuwerkerken, 7 kilometers north of St. Trond, injured and captured, Sergeant John Davidson, handed over to the Luftwaffe Lazarette Saint-Gilles in Brussels. Unfortunately, we were unable to determine the reason for this discrepancy. After Lieutenant Schnorfer's second attack, the left wing of DT804 caught on fire and the aircraft dove down steeply, but it did not explode. It fell into a meadow at the Durasweg. We have tried to locate the site as well as possible based on testimonials from local residents. Wreckage that could be linked to DT804 via serial numbers was also found in the vicinity. This is the area where DT804 crashed on the 30th of May 1943. At that time, Maurice and Louis Velcaniers were 12 and 17 years old respectively. Maurice would have his solemn communion the next day. Louis was awakened by the noise and glare of the fire and snuck out of the house. I stood by the wreck. I was alone, there were no German soldiers to be seen. On the way, I encountered the first crew member. He was stuck in the ground up to his hips. I suspect he fell out before the crash. Half of his face had been shot away. You could see right into his head. On the way, I saw piles of flesh. In the wreckage itself, in the tail, I saw a crew member hanging upside down in his harness. Both legs in the air and his head in a large pool of blood. All the bodies of the deceased crew members were buried with military honors on the 1st of June 1943 at the Cemetery for Allies of the Air Base in Brustom. On the 11th of March 1947, the bodies were excavated, formally identified and reburied at Heatherley War Cemetery. On the 18th of June, 2.5 weeks after he was shot down, Jack was transferred from the St. Gill Hospital to Dulag Luft near Frankfurt, a transit camp for Allied crew members. In the first week of July, Jack was transferred to his permanent camp, Stalag Luft 6. On the 13th of July 1944, the camp commander ordered the evacuation of the camp as the Red Army was approaching. They traveled across eastern Prussia and deep into Poland, arriving at Stalag 357 in Thorn. But after just 3 weeks, they resumed their westward march towards Fallingbostel. The liberation came on the morning of the 16th of April 1945 when a couple of Churchill tanks from the British 7th Army, the Desert Rats, drove through the entrance gate. Jack returned to his beloved Jean on the 1st of May 1945. On the 4th of June 1946, he was dismissed from the Royal Air Force and returned to his old job as a clerk at LNER Cowlairs Works in Glasgow.